This article, the USA Today article that seemed to have gotten so many people upset. Um, what was your motivation when you wrote the article?
My motivation was to raise awareness about some very problematic training that I personally witnessed. And then after I witnessed it, I did some research and I realized that this particular company is the center of a national controversy regarding some very problematic use of force training. This is a company that is used to train law enforcement agents all across Tennessee and all across the country. And I thought it was necessary to let people know about it.
Nice. That I can completely understand. Um, so, as a result of the article, organizations like the Memphis Police
Hold on a
Association.
second. Yes, come in.
Okay.
Hey, we're good. Thanks. Go ahead.
So, as a result of the article, your critics, like the Memphis Police Association, um, have claimed bias that would prevent your office from fairly evaluating officer involved shootings. If an officer uses force tomorrow based directly on the tactics taught in those certified courses, how can that officer trust your office to evaluate their actions objectively without a predetermined bias?
Well, I mean, there's actually no merit whatsoever to the point that there's any predetermined bias, and there's several reasons for that. The first is that the article in question criticized one type of training by one particular company. It wasn't any kind of broad indictment against law enforcement generally, or even law enforcement training generally. And the reason you know that is if you actually bother to read past the headline. Anybody who reads past the headline can see that for themselves. We evaluate every case on the facts and the law, and we have done so for years and will continue to do so. And not that these numbers are necessarily dispositive, but it's probably useful for anybody who has that question to note that we have investigated about 30 police use of force cases since I've taken office, and we've declined prosecution in 29 of them. So there's clearly no objective evidence to suggest that there's any kind of anti-police bias in that context. In fact, just this week, we declined prosecution with respect to the killing of Mr. Pigram by DEA agents at a Burger King. And I know that has caused, concern on all sides, but it's yet another example of us looking neutrally at the facts and the law and acting appropriately.
Are you using independent judges? No, I'm sorry, that's not what I was going to ask. Is why do you think there's such a massive disconnect between your office's data and the actual daily perception of safety among everyday Memphis residents?
Well, I guess I might have to push back against two embedded premises. First, it's not just our office's data. This is the data from the Memphis and Shelby Crime Commission, which compiles data from law enforcement agencies and the criminal courts. And, no matter whose data you look at, the clerk's office, the courts, the law enforcement, ours, the crime commission, the story's the same. We've had 10 consecutive quarters of double-digit percentage decline in crime, 8 of those before the federal task force even got there. So it's not our data, it is the data that says that. Second, I'm not so sure, Jerome, how much anymore there is a disconnect between public perception. I think in 2023, in 2024, even in 2025, there may have been a lag between the decline and the stats accordingly, and then the public perception of that. And I think that kind of lag is present always and across the country and has always been the case, even in Shelby County. But I think by the time we're in the middle of 2026, I think even average people acknowledge that things aren't as bad as they were when we had that nationwide spike in 2023. And I'll just give you one concrete example. Remember in 2023, there was that YouTube video that came out that taught people how you could hotwire a Hyundai or a Kia Infinities. And there was this massive spike in car thefts. It seems like everybody you knew somebody who had their car stolen. Well, we don't hear that kind of talk anymore. So I think we're actually now getting to the point where the statistics and the reality of the crime decline is actually seeping down into public perception.
Well, I think big part of the questioning with the data has come from political um, candidates or people in office trying to paint a narrative. Um, and not showing the facts. I think their own audit proved that they weren't showing the facts, which
I think
is
that's a good point. There were politically motivated actors, political officials, and those aligned with them who I think you correctly say have a partisan or political motivation to try to, poo-poo the crime decline and to try to cast doubt as to how good things have been. And in fact, they even suggested that Memphis Police Department was cooking the books. They were juking the stats, toying with the numbers until there was an audit done, as you pointed out, said there was nothing wrong with their numbers. Now, crime's still too high. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'm not popping any champagne corks anytime soon. We still have a very, very high crime rate, but the trend lines have been in the right direction for 2.5 or more years. And I think the people that are trying to deny that are, as you correctly pointed out, I think politically motivated.
let's move on to this question, which is the more you investigate these things, the more you get shocked. Uh, the kinds of things that people would make accusations of. Are you using independent judges as a political shield to deflect from structural weaknesses in your own prosecutor's case presentations?
No, um, we have responded to criticism specifically directed towards our office that was unfair criticism about the disposition of cases. And in so doing, we pointed out correctly that the vast majority of cases that they were pointing to, people did in fact serve jail time prior to conviction, or they served prison time as part of their sentence, or if they got probation, then it was because it was a minor nonviolent offense where they didn't have much of a record. A big percentage of those were first-time offenses. But in the course of that, to provide context, we did point out that about 20% of the cases that our critics were pointing at us, we in fact had asked for a prison sentence and the judge went in a different direction. Now, that's not to point the finger at judges or to throw the judges under the bus. In fact, I go out of my way publicly in my statements to say, even when we disagree with the judge's decision in a particular case, that we respect the judges. I'm a big defender of the judges and their judicial independence and their own discretion. But it's certainly fair for us to provide context that in 20% of the time, when people are saying, oh, it's our fault that someone who should have gotten prison time didn't get prison time. It's fair to say, well, in 20% of those cases, we asked for prison time and the judge went in a different direction.
So let's talk about something that um, people have had on their minds. You promised to track recidivism numbers. I always get that word wrong. So,
Recidivism, yeah.
but if those numbers came back showing that these supervised individuals are reoffending, will you publicly admit this cultural shift at 201 Poplar failed?
So, one of the things that I want to do and I'm committed to do is data-driven decision making. And I think that, the data from around the country clearly shows that the approach that we're pursuing, which is to lean more heavily into rehabilitative interventions that have been proven to reduce recidivism, I think, is a data-driven decision. If, however, the data shows that a particular type of intervention isn't working or a particular type of approach isn't working, well, then obviously we're open-minded about this and we'll adjust accordingly. I think the essence of wisdom is to try things and see if they work. And then if they don't work, then try something else.
Nice. I like that. And I think that's the way everything should run. Um, when your fellow prosecutors, the police union, state lawmakers, all aligned against you or against your philosophy, is it possible that it's not them misreading your words, but rather you misreading the fundamental nature of law enforcement in a
So
city?
respectfully, let me push back again a little bit on some of the premise of the question and separate out two different issues. So first of all, it's not all legislators or all DAs. There were a half a dozen or so DAs that expressed concern about my particular USA Today op-ed piece, which, as I said earlier, I think they clearly misread. And then, there are one or two high profile legislators who, for political reasons, in the past couple of years have, made it their goal to throw darts at me, but, not at all the entire legislature. And the reason we know that is because back in the spring of 2025, there was one state senator who tried to have the legislature get me removed. and that bill didn't even get a hearing, right? So, let's not catastrophize. But I think also we need to separate out two different issues. There's the issue of any disagreement with a particular approach of our office, and then there's disagreement about the USA Today op-ed piece that I published. And I will, point people to Jeff Calkins, who I think is a respected, non-political person who has publicly said, look, anybody who reads the USA Today op-ed knows that it was a criticism of one particular company's training and not an indictment of law enforcement across the board. And he, in fact, was circulating a really great Daily Memphian guest editorial written about 5 or 6 days ago, maybe in the
I
last
saw
week.
it.
Yeah, by a person who trains emergency dispatchers for a living, who said the same things. That actually look at the guest editorial and see it for what it was, a criticism of one particular company. So I think we need to separate that out from the broader criticism of the approach of the office. Now, there are a couple of right-wing politicians who, for political reasons, have tried to criticize the overall approach of the office. And what I would say to the average person who hears that debate back and forth and is trying to figure out whom to believe, the proof's in the pudding, Jerome. Take a look at the crime trends. We had a decade-long rise in violent crime under my tough on crime predecessor. Within 9 months of me taking office, the crime finally started to go down.